welcome to you all. So as Bruce has said, my name's Giles Newton-Howes. I think it's really important when you come to listen to people speak that they tell you a little bit about who they are, what they do and why they're here. And the reason I think that that's important is because, like it or not, we're all biased in what we do. And if we ignore the fact we're biased, we're probably missing one of the most important reasons why we're doing most of the stuff we're doing. I might be a psychiatrist, which is why I think that, but that in and of itself is a bias, I suppose. So this, I guess, graphically represents the bits of me that are important for this, in large part. So, as Bruce has said, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I did my medical training here at the University of Otago, and I'm a Wellingtonian. So kind of my socio-cultural education is one of a born and bred New Zealander, and I did my psychiatry training at Imperial College in London. So as part of that, about half of that was spent doing addiction psychiatry. So I spent a lot of time seeing a lot of people who have had a lot of problems with psychoactive substances. I'm not a GP, seeing patients with epilepsy and intractable pain a lot. I've seen a lot of people who've had a lot of problems, really big problems. And I guess in this context, that's of relevance. Because all about today is about prescribing, and I completely agree with Graham here, drugs that change the way your brain works and how you perceive and understand the world. And those sorts of drugs carry with them inherent risks, both from an evidence and experiential perspective. So I think when you're going to hear some of what I talk about, I guess it's because of that clinical anecdotal experience I've had. I'm an associate professor at the University of Otago. And I also think that's important because it means I'm a bit of a geek. I spend a lot of time reading papers. I've been sitting at the back of the room trying to sort out a conference. And as one of my colleagues said to me the other day, Giles, you just need to get out of your head. And so I do put a lot of weight on the evidence. I do think that is one of the key differences in terms of health professionals between medical practitioners and other health professionals, or people who are trying to help other people. So an awful lot of people make their livings, do their jobs, and engender a lot of personal well-being out of helping other people. And I guess one of the things which is not quite unique but of particular importance in medicine is that we try and blend art and science. So I'm kind of interested in the sciencey bit. I have some cannabis affiliation, so both with MCRC, which is a local New Zealand cannabis consortium, and then one of the international advisors to ACRE, which is the Australian Cannabis Consortium, both organisations of which have I guess an advocacy role from seed to problems in trying to assist governments, federal, state and here in New Zealand, to think about what they're doing in terms of cannabis change, and whether you like it or not, that's coming. You know, the way society sees cannabis is different now than it was when I was a kid. And that change will continue to accelerate. I'm also a member of PHARMAC, which is the Pharmaceutical and Therapeutics Advisory Committee for PHARMAC. So I have a very positive view of PHARMAC and what PHARMAC does for New Zealand. And I think if I look at all of the roles that I do, I actually wonder if it's the role in PHARMAC that delivers the most good for all of New Zealanders. For all that, not being able to prescribe whatever you like for free for your patients is sometimes very frustrating for many doctors. And I work clinically, so half-time I'm an academic and half-time clinical, so seeing patients, advising largely other consultant colleagues in mental health. So when I think about cannabinoids, I'm thinking about them with these various personal pressures, and that's where I'm coming at this from. So it doesn't take a genius to know that cannabis, cannabinoids, medical cannabis are part of our society, a really integral part of our society. So depending on exactly who you believe, we're in the top 2 or 3 and at the very worst 5 users of cannabis in the world. So after tobacco and nicotine, cannabis is the 3rd most used psychoactive substance. Curiously, it's very difficult to see how much caffeine is put into all of that. So there's an awful lot of cannabis around, and there's an awful lot of cannabis around in New Zealand. And that's important both because a lot of patients that you will be seeing will be smoking cannabis regularly, and like Graham has said, if you don't ask them, they won't tell you. There will also be a not inconsiderable number of you guys in here who smoke cannabis for either purported medical or recreational uses. And So cannabis is kind of an ingrained part of our culture and who we are. You'll have personal views about it, either because you use cannabis, or you have used cannabis, or your kids use cannabis and trying to figure out what to do about that. And so most of us will have some kind of experience, and we just need to bear that in mind when we think about this. I guess the other thing which is really important for us to bear in mind as medical practitioners is that there is a very strong lobby that drives the very positive views of cannabis as a social good. So, some of these pictures are up here. Your kids won't know who I am, but they will know who Snoop Dogg is. And so what they see are lots of very positive celebrity images of people who advocate for and smoke cannabis and say how wonderful it is without thinking about all of the potential risks. Like it or not, as we condone cannabis and cannabinoids, we are in some ways condoning that culture, and so some stuff is starting to be written by sociologists about the relative risk of that. So kind of understanding how various medicines and or dried whole plant extracts may work is really important for your practice. But actually what you do, how you talk to your patients and what ends up happening is going to be influenced by the social society, the pressures that you're in and are put on you by your patients and by society in general, and are going to be reflected in what society does. So to give you an example, the cannabis market in the US last year was worth $202 million US. They estimate this year the cannabis market in the US will be worth slightly in excess of $2 billion US. It depends exactly on who you read, but cannabis is one of the top three and often the top fastest growing industry globally. So people realise that this is a massively growing industry, and it's without question the fastest employer of people in the States at the moment. So this is an area where there is a huge amount of interest. The companies who are most interested in seeing the development of cannabis and cannabinoid products are not big pharma, they're big food and big drink companies. So the companies that are investing most heavily in cannabis and cannabinoid products, wrapped up however you like, is not being driven from medicine or pharma. And although you may not think of this as being particularly relevant when you prescribe CBD to one of your patients who have a discussion about cannabis, this tells us something about the social drives and how globally, certainly large capitalism views cannabis. And my inference from that, and it's an inference, is because what they see is a decriminalised cannabis market, and they see very large profit in that. And they're probably not wrong. And so they are some things to kind of bear in mind. So if we think about cannabis and cannabinoid products from a medical perspective, I guess. So cannabis has been a drug that doctors have prescribed for the benefits of their patients for a long time. So, I think 5,000 years is about as far back as you'll see written about or noted in the literature. From a kind of a Western perspective, at least 3,000 years. And from, I guess, a modern Western perspective, it was brought back from India as essentially probably a one-to-one THC CBD product. In about 1800s, was rapidly picked up across a wide sector of society. So this was used both as a tincture and a dry product, both from kind of paupers right up to Queen Victoria, whose physician advocated for it very strongly. It rapidly made its way into the US pharmacopoeia, and so it's been used and widely used for a variety of medical conditions for a long time, until in the mid-20th century, it was slightly different in different places, it became criminalised really. And again, we're not going to spend too much time talking about criminalisation or decriminalisation of it, but from a medical perspective, essentially what that did was prevented us really understanding this drug in a kind of a modern Western medical sense. So that has been a very major impediment towards really getting our heads around how this might be useful in a modern medical sense in terms of treatment. And that continues to be the case. If you're interested in some of the sociological backstory about why we think cannabis might have got criminalised and the changes about that, I'd recommend you watch a movie called Reefer Madness, which is narrated by Woody Harrelson. It's both funny and very factually accurate. It's got nothing to do with medicine at all. And so what we see now, I guess, is this re-emergence of an understanding that cannabis and its various constituents might have real medical utility, and as Graham's already talked to you about, very clearly for some people it does. I think that is an undeniable fact. So I guess I was reading these slides late last night, and when I was reading about it, I thought, I kind of feel a bit like I might be at the edge of teaching you all to suck eggs, which kind of wasn't really the purpose. It's more that there's a bunch of things that we take for granted when we practice and are seeing patients and are doing some stuff, particularly when it comes to prescribing a tablet. And these are things that we take for granted, but our patients take for granted too. And these are the kind of assumptions and the unwritten rules around what we do. Just like when I go and see my GP, there's an unwritten rule that I am the patient and she is the doctor, and I'm going to tell her my symptoms and she's going to tell me what to do about it. That's the rule. That's about my illness behaviour and the sick role that a patient's supposed to be in. And very often when patients don't fulfil their sick roles and when doctors don't fulfil their medical role, you end up seeing me as a psychiatrist. So I work mostly in a personality disorder service at the moment. Those roles are important, but when it comes to prescribing a medicine, what it means is these sorts of things are the things that patients expect and are kind of an unwritten societal contract. And we don't think about it very often, partly because we don't have time and partly because we don't need to, especially here in New Zealand. And the reason that we don't need to is because we've got really good government regulatory authorities that do this for us, as they should. And Midsafe has been extolled as one of the best regulatory authorities in the world for the management of medicines. And PHARMAC has been extolled as one of the best public health drug buyers globally also. So actually in New Zealand we're blessed because we've got some really good systems that work for us. So when we see our patients and we're thinking about prescribing, we don't need to do that stuff. And obviously in this particular space, this is important because what we're not doing is engaging these kind of bits of our national system and thinking around the prescribing of cannabis or cannabinoids, at least not at the moment, unless you happen to be prescribing Sativex for spasticity, as Graham has already said, and that has gone through Midsafe and is Midsafe approved. I mean, outside of that, and I think something for you to ponder is to ask yourself the question, why has that not occurred? So what is it that is preventing pharmaceutical companies from simply registering their cannabis products? And that's something that's worth bearing in mind when you think about what you're doing when it comes to prescribing. So something I particularly liked about Graham's talk, and something I think is really, really important when we think about this too, is exactly what we're talking about. So you'll see from what the Midsafe presentation earlier this morning, when they talk about cannabis, they're talking about anything that's come from a cannabis plant. But actually, there are a whole lot of cannabinoids. You can make synthetic cannabinoids. It's not that difficult. It's pretty easy to do in the lab. And you can make a whole bunch of derivatives from this that, again, a bunch of your patients will be taking off the streets. And synthetic cannabinoids can be either molecules that essentially look exactly the same as the molecules you might suck out of a plant, or they're those molecules that they've then tinkered with. They add stuff to, they break the benzene rings apart. And playing with cannabinoids, the organic compound itself is not very difficult to do. So it's real easy for a chemist in a lab to mess around, like cooking, with a cannabinoid product to produce a synthetic cannabinoid. So when you're thinking about cannabis and the prescription of cannabis, and really importantly, at least to my mind, when you're thinking about the advice you're giving to your patients around cannabis and cannabinoids, is thinking about, what am I actually talking about? Okay, so as an addiction psychiatrist, the usual patter I would have for people, so I worked in Waira for 6 years, the patter would go something like, do you smoke dope, bro? And the answer would be no. And I'd be like, what about on a Friday after your box of tinnies with your bros? And they'd be like, maybe if someone bought it. And I'd be like, so would that be 3 or 5 times a week? No, it wouldn't be 5, doc. So you only smoke the weekend, sort of Thursday to Monday. Yeah, that's about right. and maybe once or twice in the morning before I go to work. I'd be like, so do you buy by the ounce or the pound? And you'll need to start learning how much is an ounce of weed? It's a lot. How much is a pound of weed? It's ridiculous. And they'd be like, don't be crazy, man. I only ever buy half an ounce a month. And so something like that would be a standard conversation, right? And so trying to work that out, or if they're buying from the tinny house, if they have a regular supply, those sorts of things are kind of important because you can get some inference about what they're smoking, what they know about what they're taking and what difference it makes. And so when, one of the advantages I have is time. One of the advantages you don't have when you see patients is that. But if people are coming to you and asking for advice about cannabis or cannabinoids, if it's not stuff you're prescribing and it's not in a bottle where you know what it is, you can get onto increasingly shaky ground pretty quickly because it's very difficult to know what you're actually providing advice about. And I think that's something that we hear about a little bit in the literature and the kind of editorials and commentary sections of some of the journals I read, but it's something that we can slip into thinking about without really thinking about it. And so that's not to say that some of what you've heard today isn't absolutely bang on the mark and technically accurate, but it is important to bear in mind that we should be talking about a drug so we know what it is, we know the doses of what we're using, we know what science there is behind it and what lack of science there is behind it. And as I remember the good Professor Ferguson saying once, he ran the Christchurch Health and Development Study, multiple anecdotes don't equal evidence. And so multiple anecdotes are important, but they're not evidence. And that is an important difference to bear in mind. So the stuff down the bottom, good, no problem. The stuff up the top, not for us. And we can know a little bit about how this works, how this interaction between society, cannabis, and medicine, doctors, and medicinal cannabis, whatever that means, works, because we've done some research on it. So Pledger and his colleagues took a look in the New Zealand Drug Survey back in 2013 at who uses cannabis, right? And this is what they found. So the people who tended to use these cannabis medicinally, so they just asked you, do you use cannabis, do you use it as a medicine? So they are basically male, younger, less well educated and relatively poor. So I guess when I have anxiety about the increasingly socially acceptable use of cannabis as a medicine, it is not about treating the 3-year-old with Dravet syndrome, which Lindsay, one of the paediatricians here, was involved in what I see as being the first really high quality, groundbreaking randomised control trial that shows the benefit by reduction in seizures and improvement in functioning of CBD for a particular type of Dravet syndrome. So it's a pretty rare childhood epilepsy. And I'm not thinking about, the person who's got whatever horrible disease they have, which you're pretty confident they're going to be dead in the next 4 weeks from. I'm thinking about Joe Average Kiwi. And when I think about the way the law is written and what constitutes requiring palliation, I'm also worried because sometimes I feel like I need a bit of palliation, particularly if the kids are being ratbags. So it is worrying when we know that the sorts of people who are going to come and ask you for this, the sorts of people who are going to want cannabis and who will perceive themselves as using it as medicine, they're male, younger, so 30s they're talking about here, less well educated, relatively poor. And the sorts of things that they'll come and ask you for them are these sorts of things. So pain, and we've heard a little bit about pain, and we're going to hear a little bit more about pain. There he is. There's our pain man, which is why I haven't bothered circling that. But importantly, they also would say that they need it for this stuff here, anxiety, nerves, and depression. And they're the third one after psychiatric uses is sleep, interestingly. But we know some stuff about cannabis, so smoked cannabis, THC, CBD products, in most mental illnesses. To cut a long story short, the more robust the science, the better it is for you, however you want to wrap it up. Now that's not the same as CBD only products. So the evidence is weak, poor to not totally non-existent when it comes to mental illnesses and CBD only products. But I think there is a signal that in a decade we're going to have pretty good evidence that there will be some value for some specific disorders at some clear doses. probably very significantly higher than Graham's talked to you about in terms of prescribing. But we're in the kind of preclinical trial stage at the moment. And so this stuff's kind of important. So you're going to get young, poor, less well-educated guys come into you saying, I need cannabis for my anxiety, please, doc. That's what they're going to come and ask for. At least that's what the evidence here from New Zealand tells us. And this is exactly the sort of person whom I suspect prescribing medicinal cannabis, whatever you mean by that, is exactly not the right patient to be prescribing for. So one other thing I haven't got here is that it's very clear, mostly from cross-sectional research that's been done in America, places like Colorado. If you asked about preferred methods of use, and again, I'm not talking here about your 3-year-old with epilepsy or your person with a month of death, is smoking followed by eating. So they're the two most preferred uses, and they are the uses that are most commonly in people who take THC containing products, the best mechanisms for intoxication. And so, it's very clear from what Graham said that kind of understanding why people are taking it, how they perceive this, in route of modality is important. And we're right at the very beginning stages of this in New Zealand. But if we look at some places where medical cannabis has been around for much longer, there's certainly an indication that that's the way it's going. And if you think about who's investing in cannabis and who's developing these products, I can promise you that the only medicine Graham will have ever tried as a gummy bear are cannabinoids, because you don't go to your pharmacy and you get gummy bear paracetamol. Although you can get little fish oil fishes, I suppose. And so that's some stuff to think about. Very briefly, I get to see the harms from cannabis in my addictions medicine role and in my general psychiatry on-call role. And those harms are pretty clear from a psychiatry perspective, both in terms of acute intoxication and in terms of more chronic use. And they tend to be around the worsening of anxiety and depression, and really importantly, the development of psychotic mental disorders. I think they are really importantly, if you're an adolescent, so 16 to 25, there are 2 very large long-term cohort studies, one of which is done here in New Zealanders, that show us it increases your risk of schizophrenia 4 to 20-fold. So when I started training, I guess we still weren't sure. I'm pretty confident now that if you smoke in those important apoptotic parts of your brain development, you really significantly increase your risk of very chronic misperception of the world and understanding of what's going on. We kind of wrap up as being this diagnosis of schizophrenia. And there's a bunch of other research around this. The latest article I read was a large study that they've done in Sweden where they can do these awesome linkaging studies. And they were looking for this. They were looking for a link between cannabis and, in this case, lung cancer. 65,000 patient years, couldn't find one then. Interestingly, the biggest weakness in their study is the only way they have a measure of cannabis is self-report, which they note is a massive weakness and potentially makes the study fatally flawed. But we haven't found the sort of links, as Graham's mentioned, that we have before, which isn't to say it isn't without very significant problems. In terms of the development of cannabis use disorder, so alcohol and drug use disorders, probably the best study published in JAMA a few years ago. We have a nice natural state-by-state experiment in America. There were 23 states where there was legislation allowing the prescription of cannabis and cannabinoids, either medically or recreationally, or didn't. And essentially what they were able to show was a 3-fold increase in up to 10% of people in states where there was you were allowed to use cannabis and cannabis use disorders compared to the states where you weren't. And it's pretty clear there that there seems to be this correlation. Is correlation causal? Definitely not. But it is something important to notice, and there's no reason to think that things won't be the same here in New Zealand. So bearing in mind, we can't see the people we need to see now in addiction services. It does make me anxious about what that means in terms of need for services for people who are using it as years go on. So I left this out initially, but I thought I'd add it because it's one of Nick's good papers. So this is a study from Australia done by Nick and Wayne Hall and others. So this is a large cohort. Nick's doing a lot. He's a great psychiatrist, excellent researcher, doing a lot of research looking at cannabis and cannabis-based products. When I caught up with him last in Sydney, he, in his indomitable style, he's an amazing extrovert, isn't he? Came and sat down and got a coffee, and he's like, Giles, I've got 1.5 kilos of cannabis at home. And I don't have my cannabis safe at home, it's at the lab. And I'm like, Nick, what are you doing here? Go home, get that and get it to the office. So it's one of these problems you have when you've got a license to have cannabis. So they followed up a whole lot of people with chronic opioid pain. And what they wanted to know was, if these people used cannabis, did it improve them? Were they better? So this is one of the claims that has been made. Well, the opioid crisis is a major problem. If people are able to smoke dope, they'll use less opioids and they'll be better. And it's got good face validity. It kind of makes sense, right? But actually, when you do this in a robust cohort way, it doesn't happen. So they found that there was no evidence that cannabis improved patient outcomes. And actually, it probably did them harm. I'll send this paper in your direction. So and again, this is not CBD products. This is people who are just using cannabis. So self-reported use of cannabis, almost certainly all smoked, almost certainly dried, all whole dried product. Pulled the plants out of the ground, dried them, rolled them up, and smoked them. But people who are smoking cannabis regularly clearly did worse. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that there's something about us which is important to remember as we come into these consultations. We're just talking about this at lunch. When I see someone, what I really want to do is something good for this person in front of me. So for me, because I'm a bit of a geek, what that means is doing something that's really clearly evidence-based if I possibly can. But that's also quite difficult because the evidence in terms of effective long-term interventions for people with personality disorder is terrible. So I'm constantly working with the fact that there's a bunch of ambivalence about treatment and that the evidence I have to base what I'm doing on is limited, and about trying to work around how we can do the best with what we have. So I'd be lying to you if I said my clinical practice was evidence-based. My clinical practice, much as I hate to admit it, is evidence-informed, because that's the best I have. And I think the place we are at the moment when we think about the prescribing of cannabis, at best we can argue that the evidence base for what we do is evidence-informed rather than evidence-based. Although there is a growing number of studies which will help us move from this position of information to being more evidence-based in what we do. And some of that evidence is positive, but an awful lot of that evidence is negative too, and we need to be balancing those things together. And I guess the other thing to kind of bear in mind, and I'm not a GP, and I don't run a full service practice. I don't get paid more the more or fewer people I see, and I'm very happy for you to all berate me. And if I'm out of line, I want to know. But what the evidence tells me is if you provide a fee-for-service practice, there are pressures, and it makes good sense, and the evidence would seem to bear this out, that you see people for shorter times, you see more people, and you're more likely to do something like give them a prescription. So, that's kind of what you are sort of trained to do by your clinical work, and the evidence would bear out that that seems to be what happens, which is, you can argue if that's good or bad, right or wrong. I think it's just a reality of the way we've built general practice in New Zealand. And so as more and more people come to develop an expectation that cannabis is a medicine that their doctor will prescribe, you'll be under increasing pressure to provide cannabis as a medicine, and it's going to be increasingly difficult for you not to do that. And again, that's not about your individual practice, that will be about the social pressures of being a doctor in New Zealand. And that's something important for us to bear in mind. So I had to think very quickly about the sorts of things that you might need to start thinking about when you think about talking to your patients about cannabis, because they'll probably come and speak to you rather than go to speak to, rather than waiting for you to raise it with them. So I think this is important. Being clear that what we do when we're doctors and are talking about prescribing cannabis is not about decriminalisation and not about condoning social use. It isn't about these cool pictures. You'd be amazed how many pictures there are of grandmas smoking weed on the net. It's not this that we're talking about. It's about the use of a particular medicine that we know what it is to do a particular job for a particular product. That we need to be clear and honest with our patients that the evidence for the use of cannabis in many conditions is really weak. So this isn't a place where we can say that there's good evidence that supports X for Y. You may have some anecdotal experience that you can draw on, but actually our science at the moment is pretty weak. At best, I think we can argue that the practice we are providing is evidence-informed, not evidence-based. That doing nothing isn't the same as doing nothing at all. So doing nothing is doing something, and possibly doing something important. So actually, and you guys may get way more of this than I do, because no one ever tells me not to prescribe antibiotics, but not prescribing is actually really important. And not prescribing might be the best thing you can do for many people who come to see you over the next few years. Maybe not everybody, but for many people over the next few years. I can't imagine that smoking cannabis is ever going to be okay and ever going to be something that will be seen medically as being appropriate. And unless you have an intractable condition, I guess I don't usually think about this, and by intractable I mean something which is grossly impairing your life, severe epileptic disorders, some a cancer or something which is going to kill you in weeks to months. It's difficult to see how prescribing or cannabis use in adolescence or early adulthood is a viable, sensible proposition on the basis of the evidence to date, which would suggest it significantly increases the risk for a small number of people of very serious conditions. And so I'd argue that you should get engaged. I heard from our first speaker, who I think is gone now, that apparently the day is 18th of December, but 4th of December, we already can prescribe, and by the end of this year, we are supposed to have in place mechanisms across the country which will allow this to be a lot easier to do. It's here and getting more and more here. And probably your input more than my input is valuable here, because it won't be me they're coming to see to ask to get weed. It'll be you guys. I'll be the one they'll be coming to see when they can't stop it. It's a slightly different problem. And that's all I really got to say.